All right. So, as I was saying, so this all begins again. Hitler doesn't invent this stuff, right? So, it all goes back into the 1930s. By 1938, the Germans initially, or the Nazis initially, tried to like just get rid of Jews entirely, right? So, by 1938, they're essentially trying to just kick out the Jews. So, they're trying to encourage Jews to leave, sometimes forcing them to leave. The big problem, though, worldwide, is that around the world, nobody wanted the Jews. France, they don't want to encourage a whole lot of Jewish refugees to come in. They're only going to accept 40,000. The British will only accept 80,000. The United States takes 100,000, um, including people of like exceptional merit. So, like, if you're a normal everyday Jew living in Germany, you're not going to get into the United States. Typically, it's going to be people who are, scientists, lawyers, doctors, like people of like high skill levels, right? So that's the thing is that even though the Jews are, or the Nazis are trying to get rid of the Jews, there aren't a whole lot of people that are willing to take large numbers of Jews into their country because, again, like inside the United States, anti-Semitism was alive and well also. You look at this poll up here, right? So this is from July 1938. What's your attitude towards allowing German, Austrian, and other political refugees to come into the United States? Okay. 67.4% of Americans said, with conditions as they are, we should try to keep them out. Right? Now, 4.9% said we should encourage them to come even if we have to raise our immigration quotas. But remember, this is like, 20 years after, or actually not even, it's about 15 years after big limits and restrictions were placed on immigration. So the Americans were basically just like, no, we don't really want any more immigrants, and you guys are Jews, and I'm sure things are tough in Germany, but they're tough everywhere. So stay out. And again, here you go. So one of the really sad stories about this is the story of the St. Louis, which is a U.S. or is a U.S. flagship. This was a ship that was filled with Jewish refugees who were fleeing Nazi Germany. They're going to go from Germany. Then they'll pick up a bunch of Jewish passengers, various ports inside Europe. They come to the United States. They're turned back. They go to Havana, Cuba. They're turned back. Then they go to Miami. And basically, the U.S. Coast Guard is going to prevent them from disembarking. A handful were left off because of medical issues and stuff like that, or they had visas that were pre-approved ahead of time. But for the most part, they're going to be turned back to Europe, and many of those passengers later will be killed in concentration camps. Again, really good video here that talks about what anti-Semitism was like inside the United States. Again, this is embedded in the Chapter 24 video slideshow. Please take a look at it. It's really, really important stuff. Okay, so after 1938 and into 1939, then Hitler is basically going to turn his focus. He tried to get rid of as many Jews as possible, but again, there weren't many takers around the world. So he starts implementing what was known as the final solution, right? So this is going to be the genocide of inferior groups. Now, if he could, he was going to work people who were fit and able. He's going to work those people to death first. So that's where we start seeing this introduction of the term genocide, right? This is a deliberate, systematic killing of an entire population. He was trying to get rid of all of Europe's Jews, not just Germany. And you'll see as the Nazis expand into Europe, like the Ukraine and other places inside, what used to be the what used to be the Soviet Union. They're going to try to basically get rid of Jews there as well. Polish Jews also are going to be heavily targeted. But again, it's gypsies or Roma, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, like I said earlier, right? Anybody who wasn't this like Aryan master race. Okay. Um, One of the first steps they're going to take is they're going to relocate Jews into what were known as ghettos, which would be segregated areas inside Polish cities like Warsaw. So they would basically just kind of wall up, many city blocks. And as the Jews were captured essentially from different places across Poland and Germany, they'd be forced into these ghettos. And these were places where people living conditions would be terrible. There wasn't a whole lot of medicine, wasn't a whole lot of food. I mean, these people basically were thrown in and left to fend for themselves. There were resistance movements. If you were on the DC trip and you went to the Holocaust Memorial, which if you weren't there, you should go. Everybody in the world should go there sometime, just to see. It's an excellent display of what things were like. But there's a lot of information in the Holocaust Memorial about resistance movements, various uprisings trying to get free. There was resistance. There was an effort to maintain Jewish culture, even though it was essentially outlawed by the Nazis. But again, a lot of it was too little, too late. Okay, so after the ghettos, as the ghettos got more and more full, um, concentration camps are going to be begun or are going to be started. Most of the times, these were started as places essentially for work camps. I mean, things to prisoners inside these concentration camps were being forced to produce stuff for the Nazi war effort. Um, so you can see this map here, all of these, I mean, huge, huge numbers of concentration camps all over the place. And essentially, if you went to a concentration camp, you would get off the train, which many people didn't survive the train rides to begin with because they're essentially treated like cattle. But then you'd get separated out if you're too old, sometimes too young, too sick. You'd just go straight to the gas chambers, or because different camps killed prisoners different ways. But you'd get, if you're not fit to work, you get sent to the gas chambers and you're killed immediately. And if you can work, you get sent out to the other part, but eventually you're going to die anyway. Again, total tragedy. So mass execution, mass exterminations. Like I've said before, over 6 million Jews are going to be killed, plus another 4 or 5 million other undesirables, as the Nazis called them. So for a second, please, for number 6, please try and answer and think about this question: why did Hitler target Jews in the Holocaust? Okay, so we're going to switch gears now and talk about the United States, what's going on in the United States. Now, remember, we were trying to stay neutral, right? We had, lived through World War I. We weren't interested in getting involved in European affairs. However, we have the Japanese are knocking on our door in the Pacific. Increasingly, our allies, the British and the French, who we had historically been really good friends with, they're having a difficult go of it. So it becomes more and more difficult over time for the United States to stay neutral. So in 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt pushes Congress to pass the cash and carry provision. So it goes away from complete neutrality. It basically allows anybody who is willing to pay cash, you can get what you want. You want some tanks, you get cash, cool. If you want food, weapons, ammunition, whatever, we will do that. All right. Now, again, he argues that this is going to help the French and the British and keep us out of the war. If we support our friends, yes, we are getting involved, but we're not sending our troops. So sending money is okay, but again, we are kind of violating that idea of neutrality a little bit. But his argument is that if they can defeat Hitler without our help, that'll keep us out of the war. Okay? Now, by 1940, he realizes that, this is becoming not very possible. So he starts basically upping the ante here and says that we will provide Britain all aid short of war. So we're going to do everything we can aside from sending troops. Now, things get tougher in 1940 because the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians signed the Tripartite Pact, which eventually creates this idea of these Axis powers. So now you have 3 superpowers that are essentially going to try to keep the United States out of the war because all of them are afraid. I mean, we have a huge population, we've got great industrial capacity, and we're not at war. So if we would get involved, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians all realize this would be a game changer and make it very difficult for them to conquer their parts of the world. So they're going to throw everything that they can at us, hoping to keep us out of the war. And because Japan's involved, this also is going to create a very, very difficult situation because the Germans are going to fight in Europe and the Japanese would fight in the Pacific, which means the United States now would have to be fighting a two-front war. And again, if you've learned anything from World War I and now World War II, fighting a two-front war is just not ideal. Okay? So the United States, as 1940 rolls around, remember the summer of 1940. That's when the London Blitz is happening, or the Battle of Britain. This is also when France has fallen. The United States realizes, right, like we're probably going to go to war at some point. So we start ramping up our defense spending. Okay. We are actually going to begin a draft, the first peacetime draft in American history, the Selective Training and Service Act. So if you're 18 and up, you got to put your number in, and if you get drawn, you are going to serve for 1 year in the Western Hemisphere only, which means the War in the Pacific. You are not going to go to Germany. Okay. 1940 also happened to be an election year. So FDR, remember, he was elected first in 1932. Remember, overwhelming victory. 1936, again, overwhelming victory. The United States, we're still in the Great Depression. So FDR is like, there's nothing preventing me legally from running a third term. It's just been the tradition started by Washington. So FDR decides basically, hey, don't change a horse midstream, right? We're at war, sort of, or potentially at war. We are in the midst of a Great Depression. Now's the time. I'm going to run. Why would you switch to a different party or a different person? I've shown my ability to lead this country out of the Great Depression. So he runs for a third term. He gets elected with 55% of the popular vote. You can see it's an overwhelming electoral vote as well. But you can also see that some of his support is softening. All right, so the Republicans are starting to gain support back in various places in the north. So it's not that overwhelming victory that he saw in 32 and 36. Okay, now FDR then by late 1940 realizes that the British and the French, they're struggling, right? So the FDR famously says the United States is going to become the arsenal of democracy. So if the free world is going to continue to be free and not ruled by the Nazis, the United States we've got to start pulling our weight. We need to harness all of the United States economic power and strength to produce, weapons and munitions for our allies, right? So that ultimately is going to coalesce in the 1941 Lend-Lease Act. We will lend, so we're going to borrow you the stuff that you need. So like, oh, you're fighting the Nazis here. We'll lend you our tanks and planes. And it's like, obviously we're not going to get those things back, right? Like they're going to get a little dinged up. But this is just a way for us to say like, oh, we're still neutral, but we're really not neutral, right? Like we clearly are taking sides. It is in our best interest and the rest of the world's interest for the Nazis not to control all of the world, but we still are trying to not commit US troops. Okay? Now, in 1941, game changer. Remember that non-aggression pact. 1941, Hitler gets cocky, right? He had conquered most of Europe already, not tons and tons of casualties. And so Hitler decides this area down here, right, especially around the Black Sea, this is very rich in oil and natural gas. That's what the Nazis needed to fight or to continue to fuel their war machine. So Hitler decides that he is going to invade the Soviet Union. Critical error, right? Think about what happened in World War One. They waited too long to invade Russia. They get bogged down in the winter, and it is a devastating defeat for them. Same deal with Napoleon back in the early 1800s. But regardless, Hitler's cocky. He's convinced that, like, well, I've done all this. I can probably conquer the Soviet Union, right? So he decides to invade the Soviet Union. This is a major, major problem for Hitler because, again, he just gave himself a two-front war. So if you're thinking like, how did the Nazis lose the war? This is a big part of the reason, right? He does this entirely to himself. Critical, critical error. Okay. Now, Hitler also, because he is concerned about the United States potentially entering, he is going to deploy those U-boats, which just like in World War One, the U-boats exist, but this time they're going to be bigger and better and more powerful with more firepower. And these U-boats are going to be deployed in wolf packs, which are basically going to, groups of up to 40 submarines that will be patrolling the North Atlantic, sinking any kind of supply ship that is heading towards Europe. The assumption, of course, is that it's going to supply our allies, the British and the French. So this is a huge thing. And look at this map. These are American ships or American flag ships that are hit by U-boats off the East Coast. So again, we think of the United States as like not suffering attacks, but this is insane. This is a whole bunch of German U-boats that are right on the coast of the United States. And that's something we don't always hear about. But during World War II, there were Nazi submarines that were off the east coast of the United States. East Coast cities were often under orders to like turn off all the lights so that Nazis could not target them and attack them. We just didn't know what was going to happen. So even though FDR is allowing our Navy to attack these U-boats, it's only self-defense. We're still trying to maintain that neutrality.